celebrate the new year together. It's Dad again. I tossed the phone on the couch in frustration. Mom, I really need a new cell phone. This one is already dead. The charge lasts for a couple of hours. Mom sighed. God, as we used to live without cell phones, and no one was lost. Everyone somehow arranged mad. Although, she turned her gaze to the window and thought, smiling a little. You know, sometimes we did get lost. And told a curious story from her youth. Yesterday graduate Lena seriously fell in love with an 18-year-old boy from across the street. Sergei didn't take one step away from his sweetheart. I must say my mother is very attractive now, and at that time she was just a rare beauty, judging by photographs. But the idyll ended soon. Sergei was drafted into the army for 2 years. You'll forget me, he repeated gloomily, standing on the platform and holding his bride tightly to him. You'll find someone else. What are you, Sergei? Lena cried tearfully, not paying attention to the passengers on both sides of the aisle. Those who were seeing them off and greeting them, squinting at the inconceivable couple with inquisitive eyes. I won't live 3 days without you. You will soon forget that I'm waiting for you. Don't even think about it. Sergei gritted his teeth. And keep in mind, if anything go to Victor or Dmitri, they'll take care of things while I'm on duty. God forbid, someone starts pestering, just give the boys a hand, they'll sort it out quickly. And I'll try to earn my leave faster. And I'll be there. You hear me? I'll definitely be there. Just wait. The soldier routine began. Sergei, like all the others' records, ran with full dedication. Chopped the statues, scrubbed the floor in the barracks, and for a minute did not forget about Lena, who was left at home. How was she? Was she waiting? Was she missing her? Letters came often, but it was not enough for peace of mind. I wanted very much to see my beloved, to hold her hand, to look in her eyes. Lena also longed to see the soldier. She would sit at home, writing letters and endlessly reading Sergei's messages, admiring the photograph, a brave soldier clutching his automatic, looking dashingly out from under a tucked-in peak. Yearning was become unbearable, and at the end of the year Lena made up her mind. She wrote a letter to her love, saying that she would be there on December 31st to celebrate the new year together. Yes, far away. Yes, in the middle of nowhere, where there is nothing but snow-covered forest. That was where Sergei's until was located. But the young girl in love couldn't care less, so she told her mother, I'll go. Nothing will happen to me. Sergei is waiting. I wrote him a letter. He'll meet me, and everything will be fine. She wouldn't listen to any objections. She packed a bag of homemade pies, added a piece of lard, sausage, candy, and champagne. In her haste, she did not pay attention to the list in the mailbox, but rushed to her home and to her beloved. And in the mailbox, there was a telegram for Sergei. Don't come. Lena's mother got it after a stubborn daughter had left. For some reason, the letter carrier did not carry the message to the apartment and dropped in the mailbox. That's why everything happened. Getting to the military until lost the woods turned out to be more difficult than Lena thought. She had to spend a long time in a cold electric train, and then in an uncomfortable bus for which she got out in complete darkness. There was not a soul around, only tall trees crowded on both sides of the road. Here Lena became really scared, alone, in the middle of nowhere, on a dark winter evening. There was no frost, but she had managed to freeze to death on the way in the cold bus, and the heavy bag dragged her hands away. She wanted very much to cry, but she held herself back. She turned her head and noticed some houses in the distance. On a small farmstead, there were 3 huts and a frozen barn. Kind people lived there who accompanied Lena to a military unit. You should agree at once, girl, that you are allowed to spend the night, warned the escorts, the elderly husband and wife. Though, where will you spend the night? It's a military unit after all. If anything comes back to us, you will stay here till morning. Thank you. My fiancé is waiting for me, bravely answered Lena, confident that Sergei would think of something. Behind the trees, the gates of the unit appeared. The escorts, having wished them good luck and reiterated their invitation, hurried home. Housekeeping duties awaited them, and Lena desperately banged on the gate. The young surgeon looked out of the booth and almost fell over. Where did you come? A ghost or what? Lena, beating her teeth with gall, began to explain who she was and what she was doing here. Come in, take a warm bath. You'll get me in the punishment cell, grumbled the surgeon, helping Lena to settle down on a broad bench in the corner of the small guardhouse. Now I'll find out your fiancé is. But his attempts didn't bring the girl any relief. It turned out that Sergei had left for his hometown in the morning to meet his fiancée. That is her. Unable to withstand the stress, fatigue, and bad news, Lena burst into tears. What shall I do now? She wept while the frightened surgeon tried to calm her down. Where should I go at night? On New Year's Eve? Where should I look for him? Calm down. Calm down. Here, have some hot tea. You're cold. While I'll call the command and decide what to do with you. The soldiers felt the girl's distress and offered her a place to spend the night in the headquarters building, but she stubbornly refused. No, thank you. I would like to go back now. Maybe there is a bus. What bus? The warrant officer, of whom the surgeon called at once for help, shook his hand. Not before the day after tomorrow will come. As Lena's bellowing intensified at these words, a resolute decision was made to drive the girl to the nearest bus station in an army car and put her on the bus that ran to her town. The task was half done. The rookie soldier who was given the assignment drove her for a long time along a snow-covered path. The car bounced on every bump, shaking the soul out of passengers. Finally, in the distance appeared a dim light of the tiny village bus station. The soldier did not bother to wait for the girl to board the bus. He dropped her off the station and left with a sense of accomplishment. And she tiredly sighing, bought for a ticket for the next flight, which was to leave in an hour. She sat down on a bench in the building of the bus station, leaned back against the wall, and dozed off. She no longer wanted anything. No New Year's Eve, no fun. Wanted only to be finally at home in his bed, stretch her tired legs, and relax. Woke her gently touch, someone carefully removed a lock of hair from her forehead. Lena at first thought she was dreaming, but that was Sergei, was standing in front of her, smiling. But in the next minute, when he squatted down in front of her and held her tightly, she opened wide and already huge blue eyes and cried out softly, "Earring, where are you from? Do you want to list all the places where I was today?" Sergei smiled. While waiting for the bus, they found out everything. It turned out that Sergei, after sending a telegram to her girlfriend, did not come, quietly took a leave and went her to himself. He wanted very much to celebrate the New Year at home, among his family and loved ones, and most importantly with his bride, who he hadn't seen for several months. Upon arriving in town and heading first thing to Lena, Sergei found out that her mother that he had missed his fiancé. What Sergei endured until he reached his unit on a dark winter evening. And then, after listening to the story of the officer on the duty, back to the good 4-second bus station. And then? How did you get there? Did you manage to celebrate the New Year? I put a lot of questions to my mother, who, when she reached this point, became silent, smiling dreamily at her reminiscence. New Year, she woke up. Yeah. And it was the happiest New Year's in our lives. Although we got home frozen, exhausted and hungry, but we were happy and finally together. When my mother saw us at the door, she almost fainted. She no longer knew what to think. Her daughter left and disappeared, and the future son-in-law appeared on the doorstep and also disappeared. And then everything was fine. Sergei returned to the unit after the holiday. My mother and I loaded him with some homemade food. For the kind surgeon, the wise ensign, and the first-year driver, my mother separately wrapped cakes. The rest of the time flew by quickly. I studied at the institute, Sergei served faithfully, and as soon as he came back, we got married right away. And we had two. By the way, Daddy always wanted a daughter more than son. Mom was still silent, smiling her thoughts, and then turned her gaze to me. We hugged and sat next to each other for a while, thinking about our own things. I thought about how good it was that Dad had found Mom, what they hadn't fallen out of love, that they had gotten married, and they had me. And my mother rocking me softly, as in my childhood said softly, "Tomorrow we'll go and buy you a new phone." You're right, Natasha. Without a cell phone, you cannot live now. Just think, if Sergei and I had a phone that time.